Before we begin our journey on this tranquil night, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us where you're joining from. It's always delightful to discover where our listeners rest their heads as they travel with us through these ancient memories. Chapter 1. The Monk Who Jotted Down Jokes Between Prayers. I remember with particular fondness a certain long winter when I was taken in by a small monastery nestled among snow-covered hills, far from any noisy village. It was a place where bells marked the hours gently and the air smelled of old parchment, melted wax, and root soup. The monks lived in near total silence, their footsteps light upon the stone floor, their words counted like rosary beads. But there was one among them, a man of few words and a hidden smile, who filled the spaces between prayers with something unexpected. His name was Brother Odric, and he had ink-stained fingers and eyes that laughed on their own. He was neither young nor very old, but had reached that age where wisdom leans gently toward mischief. His duty was to copy manuscripts, which he did with exemplary dedication. But if one were curious enough to look closely at the margins, they'd find hidden drawings. A cat peeking behind an illuminated letter, a peasant dozing off during a sermon, or even a mouse in a habit carrying a wine goblet. The images were simple, drawn with care and precision, and between one prayer and another, Brother Odric would laugh to himself, never aloud. One day, as I was helping him sort a stack of psalms for the upcoming reading, I accidentally dropped a hefty volume of theological commentary. As I picked it back up, I noticed a hidden sketch on the inside back cover. A monk sleeping standing up during matins, with a little angel trying to keep him awake with a feather. I looked at Odric in silent astonishment, and he simply winked, like someone sharing a secret with time itself. That night, I began to pay closer attention to the books and discovered a whole hidden world, whispering jokes in the midst of solemn Latin. Some of the brothers knew, of course, and although no one spoke of it openly during long copying sessions, you could sometimes spot a pair of shoulders trembling with stifled laughter or a poorly concealed cough just after a surprised chuckle. The abbot, a stern man with eternally furrowed brows, perhaps pretended not to notice. After all, how could one scold someone for drawing a lamb making a funny face when the text spoke precisely of meekness? And there was something reverent in those gentle doodles, as if laughter in its lightness served the same God as tears and chants. There was a special charm in uncovering these little secrets beneath centuries of discipline and devotion. As if, at the edges of the sacred, there was room for the human, and the human in that monastery was humorous, a bit distracted, sometimes drowsy, but always kind. The drawings never mocked with cruelty, only revealed the everyday life as it truly was. Monks tripping over their habits, crows stealing crumbs from the refectory, or a novice trying to look solemn while reading upside down. I vividly remember a manuscript of Ecclesiastes, where next to the phrase, "There is a time for everything under the heavens," was a sketch of a monk eyeing an empty hourglass with suspicion. It was a gentle reminder that even sacred time could slip through one's fingers, and that laughing about it didn't make it less sacred, only more relatable. Brother Odric, with his disciplined script, seemed to stitch eternity together with threads of lightness, like someone embroidering flowers at the corners of a funeral veil. Sometimes, on the quietest nights, when the wind whistled through the thick glass windows and the scriptorium fire crackled faintly, I'd see Odric hunched over his parchments, quill gliding with care. Beside him, a low candle, nearly spent, cast long shadows across the table. And even there, surrounded by psalms and treatises, he would smile. Not a broad smile, just a subtle curl at the corner of his mouth, as if speaking with an invisible idea. It was in that silence that the subtlest jokes were born. A knight without trousers sneaking behind a letter P, or an angel dozing atop a cloud. We never dared ask why. Perhaps it was a way of enduring the harsh rhythm of identical days, of offering eternity, a flicker of mortality. Or maybe it was his secret form of prayer, a drawn liturgy, a hymn made of lines. There was something deeply sacred in that soft irreverence, as if Odric understood that God, too, appreciated a good laugh when no one was watching. Over the years, many of the manuscripts copied by Odric were sent to other monasteries or carefully stored in abbots' libraries. But those who received them, unaware of their creator, probably leafed through those solemn pages without ever realizing that between one blessing and another, a dancing lamb was hidden, or a demon sneezing in a cloud of incense. It was like receiving an ancient letter and discovering a secret note scribbled on the back for those who knew how to look with kind eyes. When Odric passed, on a cold morning when the mist lingered in the fields, there was no grand ceremony. Only simple prayers and a slow bell toll. But that night, upon opening an old psalm he had copied, I found something I had never noticed before. On the final page, beneath the firm golden ink of Amen, a small monk, drawn in profile, sitting under a tree, quill in hand and a smile on his face. It was him, and it was as if he were saying with tenderness, "Up to this point, I wrote with devotion, but also with joy." Since then, whenever I come across an ancient manuscript, I look more carefully at its margins, the corners of its letters, the spaces between the lines, searching for forgotten laughter, for little kindnesses that withstood time. I learned from Odric that even in the most solemn places, among candles and vows of silence, there is space for the light, the playful, the quiet laughter that lingers like soft incense. And so, on nights like this, when I remember that monk with smiling eyes, I feel deeply comforted knowing that even among the holiest of pages, there will always be someone writing with a light heart and a joke hidden in the margin. Chapter 2, The Time the Pope Banned Bagpipes. It was during a particularly windy spring that I had the privilege or the misfortune of witnessing one of the most unusual decrees ever proclaimed by a pontiff. The ceremony took place in the ancient Basilica of Saint Marcian, a place where the stones seemed to whisper long-forgotten prayers. The crowd gathered respectfully between the columns, perfumed by myrrh, chants, and expectation. And there, among drowsy bishops and fidgeting cardinals, stood a musician in garish robes, preparing his instrument, a bagpipe as puffed up as his own self-confidence. The idea was simple, a brief, perhaps moving, musical interlude. But what followed was an explosion of notes that echoed through the nave like a Scottish war cry, startling the congregation and causing the Holy Father to jolt upright in his elevated chair. The bagpipe, possessed and triumphant, howled as if trying to purge the sanctuary of all sin single-handedly, pushing solemnity into a strange space between the sacred and the ridiculous. I cloaked beneath my habit, and the weight of my astonishment could already sense it. Something extraordinary was about to be written in the annals of music and papal patience. The silence that followed was almost as deafening as the music itself. For a moment, the entire basilica seemed to hold its breath, as if even the stained glass windows were stunned. The musician, flushed with pride, bowed slightly, unaware that the Pope, up on his throne, was squinting with silent desperation. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was more a solemn perplexity, the kind that only appears in men who have heard 1,000 confessions, but never a bagpipe played like it was summoning dragons. The next day, the decree came first as a whisper on the wind, and then as thunder in the public square. Bagpipes are hereby prohibited, under penalty of severe penance, in sacred ceremonies, papal audiences, or in any setting where silence ought to be respected. The document was real, sealed, and hand-copied by monks who barely contained their laughter. The musician He was seen days later wandering through Rome with his bagpipe strapped to his back, trying to convince tavern keepers that his talents were better suited for festivals than for mass. As the weeks passed, the decree became street talk, whispered about in libraries, and even the subject of minstrel apprentices' ballads. Some said the bagpipe sound had echoed through the bones of the saints. Others swore the Pope had been haunted by nightmares in a particularly sharp key. I, who had witnessed it all from the cool shadow of a column, remembered only the expression of one cardinal in particular, an old man who, upon hearing the first blast, simply closed his eyes, muttered a psalm, and accepted that this too would pass. And yet, there was something delightfully human in the Pope's reaction. It wasn't just authority responding to disruption, but a man, perhaps weary of ceremonial repetition, being surprised by a note that tore through protocol. The musician's excess became legend, but the Pope's response, that became poetry. To ban an entire instrument for a single disastrous solo, that wasn't just punishment, it was theatre. And deep down, a subtle reminder that even the most solemn men have their sonic limits. City musicians, of course, were divided. Some quietly applauded, thankful they'd never again have to compete with that sound, like a congested ram climbing a mountain. Others, especially the pipers, protested with gentler melodies, trying to prove the instrument could in fact be tamed. They organized discreet serenades, played in flowered alleys at dusk, and even composed a song called Lament of the Silenced Pipes, which no one dared to sing aloud except in taverns after the third mug. One night I myself heard a thin young man with misty eyes play a bagpipe before a dry fountain. The melody was slow, hesitant, as if apologizing to the wind. There was no crowd, no pulpit, no threat, just him, the still water, and a song that seemed to plead with the heavens that it wasn't guilty. And in that moment, under the full moon and the distant scent of baked bread, I realized, sometimes, even the firmest decrees are born of a fright, and frights pass. Over time, the ban was quietly forgotten, like so many medieval rules born with pomp and dead from fatigue. No one formally repealed it. They just stopped copying it into newer parchments, and younger priests, who had never heard the infamous solo, gradually allowed the timid return of bagpipes at village festivals so long as they stayed far from the altar. It was as if the memory of that event had become an echo, audible only to the old and to the very attentive. Today, when the wind blows over the hills where monasteries lean over sleeping valleys, I swear you can still hear, very faintly, a drawn-out, slightly off-key note dancing among the leaves, as if whispering an apology for its former boldness. And on very quiet nights, if you listen with your heart still, you too might hear, not a forbidden bagpipe, but a charming memory of how even the sternest solemnity can bend for a moment to the clumsy beauty of an unexpected sound. And so that story ended, not with harsh punishments or toppled statues, but with stifled chuckles and bagpipes hidden among sacks of wheat. The musician, they say, went north, where the winds didn't mind loud melodies and priests had gentler ears. The Pope grew old, surrounded by soft chants and well-tuned bells, and the incident was never mentioned again, though, as a precaution, musicians in his presence began to favor flutes and lutes with a certain caution. As for me, every time I hear a bagpipe, I smile to myself, not out of mockery, but out of tenderness, for I remember that morning when solemnity faltered, incense mixed with the muffled laughter of monks, and the highest authority in Christendom was reminded that behind every rule there is always a human heart, capable of being startled, of laughing, and of forgiving a single note out of place. Chapter 3. How a Scarecrow Became a Saint by Mistake. It was a time of thick mists and slow footsteps, when mornings arrived in silence, as if the world hesitated to fully wake. I lived then in a village that barely appeared on maps, even on clear days. A handful of crooked houses surrounded by stubborn fields and wooden fences that groaned in the wind. And there, at the very edge of the cornfield, stood an old scarecrow. It had no name, for it was made of nothing but straw, rags, and a hat too worn even for the kindest of farmers. But during that particular season, when the fog settled like spilled milk, something changed. I remember clearly one morning when the world seemed tucked inside a sigh. You could barely see an arm's length ahead, and the silence was as dense as the mist itself. That was when little Rosa, the miller's daughter, came running back from the fields, wide-eyed and heart-pounding like a market-day drum. She said she'd seen a figure, still upright, arms outstretched, as if to embrace the entire sky. "A saint," she whispered, "of grey light and ember eyes." The elders frowned, but curiosity is a fertile seed in uncertain soil. And so, little by little, we all made our way there. What we found, of course, was only the old scarecrow, just as it had always been. Arms stretched in a cross, a scarf fluttering at its chin, and a head made of a flour sack stitched with trembling charcoal eyes. But in the fog's muted light, there truly was something different. It seemed taller, calmer, as if it stood there by choice, watching over the fields with a patience only saints and scarecrows possess. No one spoke a word. We simply stood, looking as if trying to understand what Rosa had truly seen or felt. And perhaps that was the most important part. That afternoon, flowers were left at its feet. Shy daisies, a rushed bundle of lavender, even a small rye loaf wrapped in clean cloth. No priest was called, and no one prayed aloud. But the gestures spoke for themselves. Faith in that place didn't come from thick books or fiery sermons. It was made of earth, silence, and small acts that gathered like autumn leaves. And somehow, that scarecrow, with its tired straw and charcoal gaze, had stirred something deep in the people, as if to remind them that miracles sometimes wear rags and stand on wooden stakes. In the days that followed, the field had never been so visited. Children left polished pebbles and colorful ribbons at its base, offerings made with more tenderness than precision. The elderly came to sit nearby in silence, like visiting an old friend. Even the skeptics, who once saw nothing more than a ragged doll, began to bow their heads slightly as they passed, an almost imperceptible gesture of respect. No one spoke of a miracle, but everyone seemed to walk a little lighter, as if carrying less weight on their chest. The presence of the scarecrow, or the saint of the cornfield, as it came to be called in whispers, had become a quiet kind of comfort. At the village church, the priest, a man of few words and many calluses, smiled when told the story. He corrected no one. He simply said that sometimes God speaks through whatever is at hand. If he can use burning bushes and stubborn donkeys, why not a straw scarecrow? And with that, the matter was no longer treated as heresy or madness. It became just one of those things the land teaches, that the sacred can easily hide in the ordinary. What mattered wasn't the object, but what it awakened. And there, among the afternoon winds and the sweet scent of dry straw, there was peace. Summer passed, and with it the cornfield ripened, tall and golden, as if the land itself were responding to the quiet devotion that now surrounded it. No one threw stones or shouted to chase off crows anymore, and curiously, the crows seemed to respect the new balance. They perched nearby, but never on the scarecrow. They watched, feathers glinting in the sun, as if they too sensed something not to be disturbed. It was strange and beautiful, as if nature itself had acknowledged the sacred mistake and chosen not to correct it. In time, even candles began appearing at the scarecrow's feet, left quietly at dusk, when the cicadas went silent and the sky turned to copper. They lit themselves in the damp dark, their flames flickering like whispered prayers. Sometimes visitors murmured their wishes, not loudly, not too hopefully, just small requests, a peaceful birth, relief from knee pain, the return of a distant son. And strangely enough, many said their prayers were answered. Or perhaps just asking was enough to bring comfort. When autumn came, with its thinner winds and leaves falling like old secrets, the scarecrow remained, still, worn. Its faded clothes now bore quiet embroideries, stitched by grateful hands. A red thread cross, a bronze button pinned to its chest like a medal. Even its hat had been replaced with a new one, carefully woven by Dona Amalia, who had lost her husband the winter before and found solace in speaking to the saint during slow afternoons. No one found it odd. It felt as if the scarecrow had always been there for a different purpose, something beyond frightening birds. One day, a traveler came to the village, one of those who collect stories and sell salt and cloth. Upon hearing of the scarecrow, he laughed gently and went to see it himself. He returned silent, thoughtful. He only said that something about that figure reminded him of his grandfather, or a forgotten promise, or himself as a boy. And that was enough. He sat with the others, shared bread and silence. The scarecrow, unmoving, seemed to welcome them all. It didn't cure fevers or make water spring from stone. But there was something profoundly human, and perhaps for that very reason sacred, about that straw figure. When winter finally descended, with its cutting winds and heavy silences, many thought the scarecrow wouldn't endure. The soaked straw, the torn fabric, the weight of frost, everything seemed to conspire against its survival. But there it stood, steady as ever, arms still open to the fields, as if guarding not the grain, but the people's thoughts. Before settling in for the long nights, children asked their parents to leave a blanket at its feet. Some even swore that on the coldest nights, the mist around it shimmered, like there was a warmth that came from something other than fire. In the end, no chapel was built, no relic was taken, there was no canonization, no angels, no trumpets. But for generations, the villagers told the story of the scarecrow that became a saint, not because it performed miracles, but because it quietly taught the power of small mistakes that turn into truth. A bundle of straw, mistaken for hope, became a shelter for the aches and wishes of simple folk. And maybe at heart, that's how many miracles are born. When a tired heart finds peace in something the rest of the world forgot. Do I still hear the soft voices that once prayed there? Sometimes, in dreams, or when the morning mist kisses the field and the silence seems to smile. Today, when I close my eyes and let myself drift into memory, I can still see it there, slightly crooked, faded by time, and yet serene. The wood of its frame, now worn, stands firm like one who has accepted the passing seasons with the dignity of someone who never asked for anything, but gave everything. Around it the grass grows soft, as if even the earth knows that here lives a story worth protecting. There are no more offerings nor frequent visits, but when the wind blows from the east and the mist drifts through the stalks, I swear I can still hear light footsteps, old whispers, and little Rosa's enchanted laughter. And so, in that village time nearly erased, the scarecrow remains, not as a recognized saint nor as a sacred statue, but as a living memory, of faith that blooms without reason, of mistakes that console, and of the quiet beauty in miracles no one expected. Because sometimes all a heart needs is a resting place, even if that place has straw in its chest, buttons for eyes, and an old hat shading its head. And that, dear listener, is all I remember before sleep takes me, cradled by mists, by stories, and by the gentle comfort of things that endure, even after being forgotten. Chapter 4. The calendar that stole Christmas from a village for 11 days. I remember well the winter when time played a trick on us. I was already a man of middle age, with knees creaking in rhythm with the seasons and a soul warmed by small traditions, like the scent of barley bread baking by the hearth, or the bells that rang to announce the arrival of Christmas. But that year, the most anticipated date for our children and elders simply didn't happen. Our village, hidden among mist-covered hills and slumbering oaks, lost Christmas. not by forgetfulness nor misfortune, but by decree from high places where learned men had decided that our calendar was wrong and that 11 days had to disappear for the world to be set right again. The news came in the hands of Father Edmar, a man of slow voice, always wrapped in layers of grey wool. He climbed the pulpit on a particularly frigid Sunday and, after Mass, explained that according to scholars in Rome and faraway kingdoms, the Julian calendar, the very one that marked our sowing and harvest, was out of sync. 11 days would be dropped from the year. 11! The village gossips murmured. The young furrowed their brows, and the children, who barely knew how to count to 20, simply looked at each other in confusion. We, the ones in between, remained silent. After all, how does one lose 11 days? And worse, how does one lose the very day of Christ's birth, the one that came each year as comfort in the long, cold nights? What followed was a strange December, as if time itself had slipped out of tune. The homes, which would usually begin to be adorned with pine branches and ribbons made from old cloth, seemed to wait for a permission that never came. Senora Aldegunda, who baked honey cakes every year on the 23rd, stood frozen in her doorway, bowl in hand, asking the heavens whether she should continue. "If Christmas has fallen out of time," she whispered, "then so will my cakes." Even the church bells, which rang joyfully on the 24th, remained silent. Time moved forward but seemed not to see us. At old Thomas's Inn, where travellers stopped to warm themselves with spiced wine and tales from distant lands, the fireplace was lit every night, but the conversations had changed. No one spoke of feasts or miracles anymore, only of stolen days and shifting dates. There was something deeply unsettling about not knowing when to celebrate. Some tried to hold on to the old calendar, lighting candles and singing hymns, while the rest of the village treated the day like any other. Others, more practical, simply accepted the new rhythm and leapt straight into January, like swallowing sorrow without chewing. But I couldn't. On what should have been Christmas Eve, I walked alone to the hill where the pines grow close together, and the wind sings like a distant choir. I brought with me an oil lantern, a fig loaf wrapped in linen, and a candle made by my sister, saved for occasions deserving of silence and reverence. Snow had already begun to fall, softly settling on the branches, as if time, despite everything, still held some respect for the seasons. I sat beneath the roots of a crooked tree that had known my childhood and my prayers, and there, without calendar, without bells, without a crowd, I lit the candle and murmured an old hymn. That night, I felt something unusual, as if time itself, ashamed of its haste, had turned back for a moment to sit beside me. The air felt heavier, quieter, and even the snowflakes fell with solemn grace. It wasn't Christmas on paper, in official prayers, or in royal decree, but it was Christmas in the heart. And in that instant, I realized the spirit of the date doesn't need permission to arrive. It appears whenever someone offers light to darkness, even if just a timid flame against the wind. When I returned to the village, I found Donna Clarice standing on her doorstep, wrapped in a shawl embroidered with golden stars. She smiled when she saw me, like someone recognizing a fellow keeper of a sacred secret. Without a word, she handed me a small bundle, a slice of walnut cake and a tallow candle she had molded herself with care and faith. "Perhaps we're late, or early," she said softly, "but still, we celebrate." And in that moment, with faint candlelight glowing from other windows too, I realized I wasn't the only one. Others had also refused to let Christmas slip through the fingers of time. That night, one by one, villagers emerged into the streets, like shadows awakened by an invisible sound. There was no grand celebration, no abundant feasts, only bread, wine, softly sung carols, and looks that said, "I remembered too." The children, confused and enchanted, followed their parents from house to house, receiving bits of dried fruit and whispered stories about a boy born on a night just like that. though the king's clock claimed otherwise. As the hours passed, the village transformed into something ancient and sacred, as if we weren't just stepping back in time, but into ourselves. The difference between the old and the new calendar no longer mattered. What counted were the hands reaching out, the shared smiles, the warmth of bodies gathered around small but sufficient fires. I remember looking up at the sky that night, a clear sky dusted with stars, and thinking that perhaps that was the true clock. One that doesn't rush us, doesn't demand haste, but simply asks us to be present. And it was there, beneath that timeless sky, that I understood. Christmas doesn't live in a number. It lives in a gesture, a memory, a song tuned by hope and remembrance. We never forgot that year when Christmas was erased from the calendar. Because, truthfully, it was in that very year that Christmas found its way into our homes with more strength, more truth, more silence. It arrived without a marked hour, without decree or permission. And it stayed, as only the truest things know how to stay, quiet, steady, and full of light. In the years that followed, even with the new calendar firmly adopted and the days marching in apparent order, we kept that tradition. We celebrated Christmas when the world told us to, but also secretly on that lost day, on that silent night only we remembered. It was our quiet rebellion against time, our way of saying that dates are just frames, and the painting, what truly matters, is made by human hands and attentive hearts. Today, when the wind blows in that particular way, and the snow falls with that same calm cadence, I still light a candle in memory of that stolen night. Not out of sorrow, but gratitude. Because it was then, in forced absence, that we learned what could never be taken from us. The warmth of a shared song, the glow of a well-lit flame, and the certainty that even when everything seems out of place, there is always a star guiding us back home. Chapter 5. The upside-down bread superstition, misfortune at the table and in the heart. I remember well a night when the wind howled through the cracks in the roof, and the smell of thin soup mingled with the scent of freshly baked bread. My grandmother, with rough hands and watchful eyes, laid each slice on the wooden table with a precision that bordered on the sacred. That's when my sister, unknowingly, left a piece of bread with its crust facing downward. The silence that followed was heavier than the winter that surrounded us. Grandma turned it quickly and murmured something under her breath, as if undoing a spell. In those days, everyone knew. An upside-down bread wasn't just a mistake, it was a bad omen. It wasn't merely superstition. It was a gesture laden with memories and ancient fears, passed down through generations as if woven into the very wheat kneaded into the dough. Among humble peasants and lords with more candelabras than meals, it was believed that a loaf turned upside down brought misfortune to the table, and worse still, disharmony to the heart. Bread, offered with care, was meant to face the sky. Upside down, they said, it invited misfortune to sit among us, serving itself uninvited. They say this belief was born in village ovens, where bread was more than sustenance. It was blessing, sharing, presence. Bakers, men of long dawns and fragrant silences, shaped each loaf with care. Some, older ones, would trace discreet signs of the cross into the dough before sliding it into the heat of the coals. And when the bread emerged golden, its top facing upward, was a sign that all was in order. To invert it even unintentionally was like challenging the delicate harmony between home and the divine. There were stories, whispered between spoonfuls of porridge and creaking benches, of couples who argued after a loaf was found upside down at supper. Children who lay awake at night, afraid that something bad was lurking in their dreams. It wasn't quite fear, it was a quiet reverence. Bread, after all, symbolized all that held us together, the hands that kneaded it, the arms that shared it, the mouths that fell silent in respect for the first broken piece. I remember an autumn when I stayed a few days at my aunt's house in a village where time moved slower. There, bread was baked in clay ovens, and the entire process was wrapped in small rituals that seemed made more for the soul than for the stomach. One morning, while helping remove the loaves, I turned one without thinking. My aunt, with a gentle yet firm look, placed her hand over mine and set it right again. "Never with the face down, dear, or joy will hide, and love will delay." In that moment, I understood that sometimes superstition is simply an old name for care. Even nobles, who claimed to be above such peasant beliefs, still observed the rule at their long tables adorned with embroidered cloths and gleaming goblets. The servants knew if, by accident, the bread was flipped, it was quietly turned back. No one mentioned it. Better that way. Destiny, it was said, had ears in the rafters and eyes on the smallest details. And among feasts and whispered vows, no one wanted to invite sorrow over a forgotten gesture. With time, I came to see that these small rules, like which way the bread faces or the silence during the first slice, weren't empty fears, but invisible threads that held the fabric of life together. They were delicate ways to show respect, reminders that even the simplest meal held something sacred. And so, a properly placed loaf became almost a prayer. May the table be plentiful, may the hearts remain gentle, and may no unexpected visitor, be they human or ethereal, cross the threshold with ill intent. On nights when the cold settled like an old dog by the door, it was around bread that families gathered for warmth. Some dipped it in salt, others in oil. Some broke it in half to make a wish, always in silence. And when all grew quiet, after the last bite and the whispered stories by candlelight, someone would inevitably glance at the loaves still on the table, just to make sure, all crusts facing up, just as the old heart demands. Outside, the wind might howl, the news might be grim, and even the harvest might fail. But inside, there was order. And that order began in the smallest gestures. The firewood stacked just right, the tablecloth laid without wrinkles, the bread turned with care. It was as if the world needed these signs to know that here, within these walls, there was peace. That despite all the uncertainty beyond, around this table, something remained steady, even if it was just the golden crust of a humble loaf resting on the right side of the wood. Over the years, I've watched this superstition fade in many places. The tables have changed, the ovens have shrunk, and families now eat in silence before glowing screens that give no warmth. But sometimes, when I sit alone at the table and place bread on my plate, I still catch myself turning it with care. Not out of fear, but tenderness, out of memory, because there's something comforting in that gesture. As if, even unnoticed, I'm telling time itself, there's still space here for what is old, for what is simple, for what longs to stay. And then, as I fold the cloth and clear the dishes, I feel that quiet stillness only old nights used to bring. Outside, perhaps the moon is high, perhaps the stars are hiding, but in here everything rests in balance. The bread was broken with care, the memories honored, and the superstition, that ancient guardian of homes, fulfilled its purpose once more, not to frighten but to protect, because in the end, these beliefs aren't really about luck or misfortune. They're about care, about the beauty of paying attention to small things. And if turning a loaf can indeed change the fate of a night, may it always be for the better. May it always remind us that there's magic in the everyday, and that sometimes all we need to feel the world in harmony is a loaf of bread, resting on the right side of a quiet table. Chapter 6. The book no one could read, but everyone kissed. In my village, there was a book that no one knew how to read, yet everyone respected it as if its words had shaped the world. It was kept in a small, dark wooden box with hinges that creaked as if sharing an ancient secret. It was thick, heavy, wrapped in leather that smelled of time, with faded letters engraved on the cover in a language even the eldest recognized but did not understand. My grandmother said those words had once been understood many generations ago, but over time the language had fallen asleep, and the meaning, like so many things, was lost like mist on cold mornings. But even without understanding it, it was tradition to kiss the book before sleep. It didn't matter if one was a child or elderly, peasant or blacksmith. Anyone passing the threshold of the old house where it rested would gently touch their lips to the worn cover. Some murmured prayers, others whispered beloved names. When I was small, I simply closed my eyes and breathed in the scent of ancient leather, as if inhaling a memory that was not mine. There was something tender in that gesture, a silence shared across generations, as if we kissed not only the book, but also all that had been spoken, felt, and forgotten. I remember vividly one particularly cold night, when winds whistled through the cracks in the windows, and the firewood in the hearth crackled as if answering back. My grandfather, who rarely spoke more than necessary, called me with a gentle nod. "It's your turn," he said, pointing to the small shelf where the book lay wrapped in a white linen band. With each step, my heart beat as if meeting an old sleeping friend. The house was silent, except for the timid rustle of flames, and for a moment it seemed even they were listening. When I touched the cover with my lips, I felt something I can't explain. It wasn't a voice or a precise memory, but a sense of welcome, as if the book, though silent, was telling me, "You belong." There was no promise of revelation, no certainty of a miracle, only the peace born when honoring what came before. After that kiss, I slept deeply, cradled not by words, but by the certainty that silence also tells stories if we learn to listen with our hearts. With time, I began to notice others. Each person seemed to have their own way of greeting the book. Some closed their eyes and rested their forehead on the cover, as if waiting for an answer. Others smiled softly, as if rediscovering a fond memory forgotten at the bottom of a drawer. One night I saw Mrs. Alvitra, nearly blind now, extend a trembling hand to touch the book with her fingertips before bringing them reverently to her lips. "It remembers for me," she murmured, and said no more. And I understood that somehow that made sense. Sometimes we sat around the fire and invented stories about what the book might contain. My brother thought it was a book of maps, with secret routes to lands where seasons never changed. My mother said it was a book of names, and that each of us was already written there before we were born. My father, with his practical way, simply said it was a sacred book that didn't need to be read to fulfill its purpose. "The value of things isn't only in words," he used to say, "but in what we do with them, or even without them." Over the years, I realized the book was more than an object. It was a handed-down gesture, an invisible thread binding us to the past. It didn't matter that its pages were stained by time or that the ink had become unreadable. What mattered was what it represented: memory, care, faith. In a world where so many things changed, where winters grew harsher and summers shorter, that book endured. And with it endured the memory that there was something greater than us, something that didn't need explanation to be felt. There were attempts, of course, to decipher the writings. A traveler once came with thick lenses and the air of a scholar. He spent days in our home, analyzing the pages with the zeal of one seeking an ancient secret. In the end, he shook his head with a mix of frustration and respect. "The language is dead," he said, "and perhaps the content as well." But my grandmother, who listened while sewing by the window, just smiled and replied, "Ah, but the love we have for it, that is very much alive." The scholar left the next day, and the book returned to its place, untouched but never forgotten. Through the seasons, I saw that the book had become a kind of mirror for all of us. It revealed no secrets, but returned our own. Each kiss, each gesture of affection before it was, at heart, an intimate conversation with something greater, with mystery, with longing, with that which we could not name but felt. Sometimes I think the silence of the book was what taught us most. In a village where words were few and time was spent working and surviving, that silence offered us a space for pause, a sacred interval between the outside world and the world within. Today, many who kissed the book with me have gone away. The house is emptier, and the beams of the roof creak with ancient weariness. Still, every night before I extinguish the lamp, I walk to the shelf, remove the linen band with the same care as always, and press my lips to that worn cover. And even now, so many years later, I feel the same quiet warmth spread through my chest. Not because I understand what the book says, but because I learned from it that some stories don't need to be read to be remembered. They live in gestures, in silence, and in the gentle kiss of every night.